Alright, let's talk about FEMA. Yes, the government agency that's supposed to help people in emergencies, getting tangled up in what sounds like a bad sitcom plot. So, imagine this, there's been a major hurricane in Florida, we'll call it Hurricane Helen, and people are desperate for help. Enter FEMA, the folks who step in when natural disasters strike, to provide shelter, food, and financial aid to those affected. Simple, right? Well, not exactly, so here's where things get weird. Former President Donald Trump starts saying that FEMA isn't treating Republican areas fairly. He goes online to vent, claiming that he's heard that FEMA isn't helping out areas that voted for him, calling it a deliberate choice. The media jumps on this, calling it yet another conspiracy theory from Trump, and declaring his claims false. End of story. Or so we thought, but then, some wild twists show up. A reporter gets hold of screenshots that show FEMA workers were indeed being told not to go to houses with Trump signs. FEMA, the government agency that's supposed to help everyone after a disaster, was skipping over homes because of political signs. You could almost imagine a FEMA worker driving by, seeing a Trump sign in the yard, and saying, "Oops, can't stop here, orders from above." Apparently, they even logged it into their system, writing messages like, "Trump sign, no contact per leadership." Now, for a minute, people thought this had to be fake. Seriously, who would believe that a government agency would tell people to withhold disaster relief based on a yard sign? But then FEMA itself came out and confirmed it. They admitted it really happened, and they were, quote, disturbed by it. They fired the employee responsible for giving these bizarre instructions, claiming they were taking extreme actions to prevent this from happening again. And suddenly, Trump's conspiracy theory didn't seem so much like a conspiracy at all. It was like that moment in a TV drama where the detective finally finds the smoking gun. Naturally, people were furious. Imagine you've lost your home in a hurricane, and as you're waiting for help, you find out that the government skipped your house, all because of your political views. It's like something out of a bad reality show. People online were saying things like, "This is why we support Trump." They felt that this incident proved that Trump was right when he said certain parts of the government weren't treating everyone fairly. And honestly, you can see why. What's really crazy, though, is that many of the big media outlets didn't change their stories after FEMA confirmed this. Nope, they didn't update or correct the articles that had called Trump's claims false. They'd already labeled it as another one of his lies, so, hey, why correct it now? It's like they were hoping nobody would notice. Even one network, which did eventually report the incident, used a completely random FEMA worker's photo instead of the employee actually involved. Maybe they didn't want to accidentally blame the wrong person. Who knows? But the whole thing just looked odd. Now, all this might sound like a one-time fluke, but it actually points to a bigger trend. Apparently, FEMA has been talking a lot lately about equity. And no, they don't mean stock investments. In this context, equity is a word that means focusing on fairness for different groups, like making sure certain minority groups and economically disadvantaged people aren't left out when aid is given. Which is great in theory. But critics say FEMA's focus on equity might actually lead to the exact opposite of what they're aiming for. The FEMA website itself has recently emphasized equity in emergency management. According to FEMA, they're now prioritizing aid based on things like race, income, and social vulnerability. The goal, they say, is to make sure help gets to those who need it most, even if that means focusing more on specific communities. But some people think that using these factors could make disaster relief unfairly political. After all, if FEMA starts focusing on people's race, social status, or who they vote for, aren't they drifting away from their main job, which is just helping people recover from disasters? And FEMA isn't alone in pushing this focus on equity. It's actually part of a bigger movement in some parts of the government to put more focus on social factors when they make decisions. You might have heard the word DI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, being thrown around a lot lately. FEMA, like many organizations, has embraced these ideas, saying they want to make sure that everyone is included and nobody's left out. Again, sounds good, but if it ends up affecting how quickly people get help after disasters, that's a serious issue. For example, there are stories of some communities getting delayed or less aid if they don't fall under certain priority categories. Disaster response should be based on the need and urgency of the situation, not things like the race or political views of the people affected. Imagine a neighborhood getting less help because they don't meet a specific equity standard. It's a bit like giving out band-aids based on people's shoe sizes. It doesn't quite add up, And, as if this story needed another plot twist, FEMA has apparently decided that certain places, like churches and religious organizations, can't qualify for aid either. So if a hurricane or flood damages a church, it's on its own. The reason? FEMA says it's all about following new rules on equity. For some people, this feels like a slap in the face, especially since churches often serve as community shelters or places where people go for help during emergencies. To top it all off, FEMA's head recently gave an interview where she talked about making equity the agency's top goal. Yep, instead of focusing on preparing communities for future disasters or strengthening buildings, she's focused on equity. If you're scratching your head wondering why this is a priority in a disaster relief agency, you're not alone. Critics think it's a case of good intentions gone bad, where the agency may be spending more time trying to check off social boxes than actually helping people in the middle of a crisis. So, stepping back, what's the moral of this roller coaster? It's that when disaster strikes, people just want help, period. They don't care about politics, signs in their yard, or which group they belong to. They just want a hand when they're down. And most people would probably agree that government agencies, especially ones like FEMA, should be keeping their focus on helping everyone, no strings attached. This story also shows how skepticism can grow when people feel like the government or media isn't telling the whole truth. When the media brushes things off or fails to report the full story, people lose trust. It's like crying wolf. After a while, nobody believes you even when you're telling the truth. And when an agency like FEMA lets politics or social factors interfere with disaster relief, it only makes people more suspicious.